Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's episode is titled, Who Interprets the Constitution? How Historians Write About Constitutional Change and Why It Matters. I'm joined tonight by Risa Golubov, Dean of the Arnold H. Leon Professor of Law and Professor of History at the University of Virginia. Today is September 7th, 2022. Hey, everybody, I want to welcome you tonight on a rare Wednesday edition of our webinar series. It's a pleasure to have each of you with us tonight on behalf of Meredith and Mike and Raven. We appreciate you taking time after the long weekend to rejoin us for our weekly, sometimes bi-weekly professional development webinars. Yesterday was the first day for the new fellowship class at the center, and so the building, our building, has also had that anticipation of the upcoming academic year, of new faces and new places, of the work that we're going to be doing together. And I hope that all of your transitions to the start of your fall semester have been similarly exciting. In particular, as I look out over the room tonight, I want to welcome Alan joining us tonight. Alan's from the University of Illinois. He's a professor emeritus. Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to get registered in the digital library and then signing up for tonight's webinar. Not so far from you, Alan, is Elena. She's in Chicago tonight. Jay is joining us as a representative of the Economic Literacy Colorado organization. Suzanne is here from Maryland. Lauren is here from the High School of American Studies. I would love to know more about that school and organization. Kay is here from nearby Wake County in Raleigh, North Carolina. Manuela is in Georgia, along with several other folks from Walton High School I see. Joseph, you're easily traveling the farthest distance. Joseph is enjoying his morning coffee in the Philippines right now, where I believe it's 7 a.m. Thank you, Joseph, for getting up early and starting your day with us. And of course, we always have a lot of teachers and educators from Southern California. Bridget at the Richard E. Byrd Middle School, Layla at Shiramoya Elementary School, Melanie, Brenda, all the rest of you at Los Angeles, thank you, as always, for joining us. As I mentioned, there's a lot of anticipation at the center as we welcome our new class. I'm really pleased to say that in the 7, I guess going on 8 years of my own time here at the center, we have always had a majority class of women in the 36, 37 fellows that we select each year of an application pool of somewhere between 600 and 700. This year is the first class in the 44-year history in which a majority of our scholars, our fellows, identify as non-white. We also have, as for the first time, the third most highest percentage of scholars in their fields is African American studies. And I say that to say that, you know, the field itself, humanities itself, is really reflective of the world we live in. It's guidance. It's a way for scholars and the work they do and the research and the writing that they do to help us understand the world. But it's also a reflection of the world we live in. And we're so pleased to see such a wide and innovative group of fellows come in with new ideas, with a lot of interdisciplinary focus, and with the kind of scholarship that's going to affect the ways that all of us teach these topics. Of course, all the content we produce at the center is free and open, and you can find it in the Humanities in Class digital library. All of you have a library card in order to sign up for our webinars. This also, though, gives you access to a wide variety of other resources. That does include the readings and the viewings that our scholars provide in advance of the webinar. Now, the reality is all of you are busy educators. You've got a ton going on. And if you don't get to the readings in advance of the webinar, sometimes that's okay. We do hope, though, that they are helpful when you come back to the recordings and linger around the conversation that we've had that night. It's really helpful in my mind to not only have access to these readings, but to know that you can use them in a fair use educational copyright, and that you can match these kinds of readings like the one that Professor Golubov tonight has provided as a way to support the webinar that you're participating in. The webinar resource that we've got displayed will also be where we post the recording of each session, and I've worked with a lot of educators who use those recordings to provide formative exercises, whether they're flipped activities as homework or something you might do in your classroom with your students, have them engage and listen and understand these complex topics, and then come into a conversation more informed. I hope you do take some time to look through the rest of our webinar series. This is number 3 out of 43, so we've got a long season ahead of us. But we do have themes that tend to emerge and surface. I can't say this is completely by accident, particularly in the the times that we're living in now, but I definitely appreciate looking back after the schedule has been created sometimes a year in advance and see the kinds of themes that I find myself emphasizing. If you're interested in more sessions on what I'll title the American Experiment, I do encourage you to join us at any one of these 4 as well as the other 39 upcoming episodes. On September 29th, Woody Holton from University of South Carolina will be joining us to talk about his book and his work called Liberty is Sweet, The Hidden History of the American Revolution. Later in the fall, we'll be joined by Manisha Sinha from University of Connecticut around the abolitionist roots of Reconstruction. Just after the new year, Earl Lewis from University of Michigan will join us to talk about affirmative action. And we'll have another historian and legal scholar, Sarah Mayo, from Vanderbilt, who will join us to discuss the Bill of Rights in February. Each of these webinars earns 5 professional development credits. And some of you probably enjoy coming on a regular basis and accruing and collecting and queuing up that credit. But if you ever find yourself really wanted to sit down and really immerse yourself a little bit more deeply in these topics, I do encourage you to take a look at our online course catalog. You can earn 35 credits in a 5-week course. We ask about 3 to 5 hours per week. These are blended courses, so there's a live instructor, and you are interacting with other participants and other registrants in each of those courses. We have 15 total courses, but 8 will be running starting September the 12th, including this one, titled Empowering Maptivists, How to Use Maps and Data to Examine Social Issues in the Humanities Classroom. I'm thrilled to be welcoming our new Teacher Advisory Council to the Center in Durham in just a few weeks. I want to welcome them to our team and tell them already in advance how much I appreciate their willingness to serve and contribute. These 20 educators represent a wide variety of disciplines and geographies, and as we move through the year, we'll be displaying their work and highlighting their work in much more visible ways. Tonight's webinar is an audio and PowerPoint only presentation, but your participation is really critical. Please don't hesitate to use the audience chat to chatter at each other and to share links and URLs and ask questions of each other. Please also use the Ask the Professor tab to submit formal questions. And as the moderator, I'll bring those to Professor Goluboff at different points so we can take some time to explore those things that you're interested in. If you find yourself disrupted for any reason, we've just had big storms come through the Chapel Hill area and power's out briefly. If that happens to you, if your sound isn't clear, or if something's crackly, really the easiest thing to do is just to refresh your screen or to log out and log back in. It will not disrupt us or our broadcast. It will also not disrupt our documentation of your attendance. So once again, I welcome you to tonight's webinar. It's titled, Who Interprets the Constitution? How Historians Write About Constitutional Change. And maybe most importantly, why does it matter? I'm joined by Risa Goluboff, Dean and Professor of Law and Professor of History at the University of Virginia. I'm also pleased to welcome Sherilyn Stauffer. She's joining us from Star Valley High School in Afton, Wyoming. Sherilyn is a member of our TAC, and she'll be with us in the audience chat, asking questions, keeping things lively. And Sherilyn is going to be developing some instructional resources based on tonight's webinar. Our real emphasis here at the center is to try to translate scholarship and content to instruction. And she'll be designing, if not a lesson, certainly an activity that will be appropriate for the high school classroom. And we'll be sharing that in the digital library. Risa, can you hear me up in Charlottesville?
I can. Can you hear me, Andy?
I can. Thank you so much for joining. I really do appreciate you taking time tonight to join us and our audience as they come in the door. In a moment, I'm going to turn over the PowerPoint to you, and you're going to guide us through some conversations, some pretty complex conversations around the Constitution. But I'd like to start, if you don't mind, with just a quick and somewhat unpredictable question that I'd like to pose to you. You may have noticed at the beginning as we were filtering in and folks were getting settled, I'm going to go back to the screen. I asked the audience to comment in the chat box about the amendment that their students seem most curious about or debate or have on the tip of their tongues. Out of 27, there's certainly 1 or 2 that are in the news cycle or they probably hear at the dinner table more than others. I'm curious from your perspective at UVA, what amendment do your students seem to be the most intrigued by? What amendment seems to be the one that they're grappling with the most right now?
I think it's the 14th, and that's the amendment that has both the Equal Protection Clause, which I'll talk some about tonight, and the Due Process Clause. It's also the amendment that creates birthright citizenship in the United States, and I would say it is the most litigated amendment. The First Amendment's pretty well litigated too, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but the 14th Amendment is where privacy rights and abortion in particular have been located, as well as marriage rights and other kind of rights of autonomy in the Due Process Clause. So that one is certainly most present right at this moment in the aftermath of Dobbs, but I think it is generally one that is most discussed, very often discussed by our students.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you had an answer immediately. I mean, you knew exactly which one that they talk about. And, you know, we've got a room full of educators at all levels who teach multiple disciplines, all kinds of disciplines in the humanities. I don't know that we have anyone with us tonight from a law school or a legal background. Can you talk to us just for a moment about the ways that you as a legal scholar approach the work you do? We understand, most of us, how historians might think or work, or how literary scholars or philosophers, but what exactly does a legal scholar do as they approach these kinds of questions?
Well, I have to say that's pretty much what my talk is about today.
Awesome.
So, I could say a little, but you know, I teach constitutional law, I teach civil rights law, I teach about the constitutional law of poverty, as well as legal history classes. So I do teach the law as well as the history of the law. And, you know, some of those classes are really about the doctrine that courts create, they're about statutes. But when I put on my legal historian's hat, that's what I'm going to talk about tonight.
Fantastic. Well, that's a good segue then, I guess, for me to you. Again, as the moderator, I will be monitoring the chat box and bringing questions and comments to you. But we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you again for joining us.
Wonderful. And I now have the slides?
You do.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Andy. Well, thank you, Andy, for that lovely introduction, and to the National Humanities Center for inviting me. And thanks to all of you for taking these precious hours from your day or your night or your early morning in the Philippines to participate. I know you get credit, and I'm glad. That makes me feel less guilty taking your time, but I also I appreciate that you've chosen to spend it with me. So I am going to talk tonight about how I, as both a lawyer and a historian, think about the Constitution and think about the law, and in particular, think about how the Constitution changes. And I don't mean how it changes in terms of the technical amendment process the Constitution has within it. Article 5 tells us how to amend the Constitution. That's only happened 27 times in almost 250 years. That's not what we're talking about tonight. We are talking about how the meaning of the Constitution changes, how our interpretations of the Constitution change, even as the text remains the same. You might think that the answer to that question, how does the Constitution change, is a really easy one. The Supreme Court makes a change. I've already mentioned one Supreme Court case, Dobbs, and that is certainly part of the answer. It's a really visible part of the answer. It's, you know, on the front page of the newspaper. We can see very clearly how it affects our lives in major and fundamental ways. It makes, though, that answer, it makes constitutional interpretation seem like the meaning of the Constitution changes because of something that happens out there or up there at the court by these 9 people in this rarefied space, right? You're looking up, the pictures of the court, you're always looking up the steps at this incredibly awe-inspiring building. And what my lecture will argue is actually that that's not really where constitutional change happens. It's part of where constitutional change happens, but I think that thinking about constitutional change that way is both unduly narrow, and it's also fundamentally disempowering. Constitutional change doesn't either begin or end at the Supreme Court. It involves regular people, and here, Andy, is really like my main answer to your question. It involves regular people who believe that the law should address their problems, and then lawyers who help them organize those problems into legal categories. It includes social movements, lawyers, journalists, scholars, government officials, politicians, teachers, so many different kinds of people. So before the court enters the picture, there are so many other people who have decided that they face problems that are maybe legal problems, maybe even constitutional problems. The issues have been shaped. The legal questions have been shaped by those people, by lawyers, by journalists, by scholars. And when the court decides a case, it's doing it on against the background of all of those prior decisions. And then, of course, after it decides a case, so much more happens in the aftermath by lots of actors as well. So I want to talk to you today not only about that process, which is, as I described it, kind of abstract. I'm going to start abstract and then I'll get more concrete as we go. But I also want to talk to you about how historians write about that process. So until fairly recently, the last several decades, most historians focused on the Supreme Court as the key actor in constitutional change, but that has really changed, as the readings I gave you show, to include all the actors I just mentioned and a much broader view. So I will draw later in this talk on two historical examples involving civil rights, social movements, and policing in the middle decades of the 20th century. And I'll show you how when you broaden out from the Supreme Court and think about who else interprets the Constitution, you open up all kinds of new meanings for the Constitution, new possibilities. You empower people, including, and I'll come back to this at the end, you as teachers and your students who far beyond the Supreme Court are participating in constitutional change. So I will proceed in four parts. First, we'll talk about this shift from the old constitutional history to the new. Then I'll offer two examples, one drawn from my first book, The Making of Modern Civil Rights, and one drawn from my second book about the Vagrancy Law revolution. And then I will briefly conclude with why it matters. So part one is the shift from the old to the new constitutional history. So I'll start with some background about how constitutional history used to be written. Before the 1980s, it largely focused on those who had written the document, the founders, as we call them, with a capital F, and on those who are generally considered to be the most authoritative and the most influential arbiters of constitutional meaning. So to some extent, this included elite lawyers and legislatures and treatise writers, but it mostly included the Supreme Court. And historians took for granted that what the Supreme Court said the Constitution meant was what the Constitution meant. And so their goal was to understand how constitutional doctrine came to be by looking at the Supreme Court. And when they looked outside the court, they often looked as well to elites, to the court's relationship with Congress or the president, or kind of high intellectual trends among lawyers or legal scholars. And constitutional histories often took the form of judicial biographies of the justices, of close readings of the cases, and of detailed explanations for why the cases came out the way they did. This often meant focusing on the winners. This was really winners' history. Why did the winners win? What did the winning side have to say? And this meant that for much of American history, the subjects here were pretty homogeneous. There were only white men on the Supreme Court until 1967. There were only men on the court until 1981. We've only recently had the first Latina and Black woman, and the court is now, of course, close to half women, but still not half. And the court also represents a pretty narrow swath of socioeconomic strata of our society, very highly educated, increasingly only coming from Harvard and Yale law schools, with the one exception right now of Amy Coney Barrett, who is from Notre Dame. So the Constitution thus appears as the province of these elite professionals who are mostly white men. And the resulting field of constitutional history was pretty narrow, pretty linear, highly preoccupied with the law in the cases and with with explaining why the winners prevailed. And so it really reinforced popular conceptions that it's other people out there, people who hold these dominant roles in society who do not look like me, whoever me might be, who are the ones who decide what the Constitution means. So in constitutional history, as in constitutional law itself, the court was supreme, and the winning arguments really erased a lot of what might have been going on beneath the surface. So that's the old constitutional history. The shift to the new constitutional history began in the 1980s as part of a shift within the discipline of history towards social history and away from the history of elites, like political histories focused on presidents at the same time. That shift was part of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s. So as previously marginalized Americans found their voices in politics, the corollary to that in history was to enable people who hadn't had a voice in canonical histories before to speak as historical subjects. And there was a volume published in 1987, which was the Bicentennial of the Constitution, called The Constitution and American Life. And it represented really a watershed moment in constitutional history. And this was a volume, an edited volume, so there were lots of different people with many different voices in it. And these historians brought to the fore voices of people who had previously been largely ignored by constitutional historians. So Hendrik Hartog, who wrote the conclusion and who I will confess was my dissertation advisor and remains a friend and mentor to me, and I think his conclusion in here was really crucial to the creation of the new constitutional history. He described this scholarly and political act of writing this journal issue as one of recovery and excavation. And it stemmed from, quote, the intense persuasion that we, and this is him still, and here the first person plural is of indeterminate and changing breath, we, remember the Constitution, that's the first word of the Constitution, we the people, that we have rights, that when we are wrong, there must be remedies, that patterns of illegitimate authority can be challenged, that public power must contain institutional mechanisms capable of undoing injustice. And so in this volume, the authors looked far beyond the work of the Supreme Court to what happens every day in various kinds of interactions between people. This included essays about labor contracts, divorce decrees, zoning variances, municipal ordinances, divorces and interfamily conflicts, and so much more. And so what this volume did was it said, everyday people, regular people, have constitutional consciousness. They have thoughts and beliefs about what the Constitution means. Those thoughts and beliefs motivate much of what they do. They motivate many social movements. And this meant that the court was no longer seen as the single arbiter of constitutional meaning or the only place that you might find constitutional consciousness. So historians wanted to acknowledge that there has rarely been a monolithic understanding of constitutional meaning, and they argued that the position of the United States Supreme Court as our preeminent constitutional interpreter is a problematic feature of our constitutional history. So constitutional law was no longer singular, it was plural, and it was no longer a thing, it was an activity. And so as a result, constitutional history became an arena of struggle between contending and changing normative orders. And I saw in the chat there was a question about, what do I really want you to take away from Hartog? And I think the two things I really want you to take away, the first one is the existence of constitutional consciousness by everyone, not just by Supreme Court justices. And then the second one is this idea that constitutional law and constitutional history are about the interaction between people with different views, rather than being a thing, a singular thing, it's a plural. So in the decades that have passed since that volume, there's been really a revolution in the field of constitutional history. And many scholars, including myself, had followed in the footsteps, although it has evolved some, which I will talk about. And we are the people who have since then chronicled the kinds of people that the 1987 volume had in mind, as well as all kinds of other people. So the 1987 volume came out of the progressive social movements of the 60s and 70s, and they had in mind stories about enslaved and free African Americans and civil rights activists, women and reproductive rights claimants, LGBTQ Americans, religious minorities and free speakers, human rights activists, criminals, potential criminals. But recent historians have broadened beyond those contemplated in 1987 to include the history of religious and political conservatives, anti-abortion activists, gun rights advocates, anti-feminists, corporations, government officials, and to extend this beyond the United States as well. But one of the crucial pieces of this is really to point out all of the different kinds of actors who are participants in creating constitutional history: lay people, social movements, lawyers, judges and bureaucrats, academics and teachers, politicians, journalists, foundations, and even mobs. That all of these kinds of people and more are constitutional actors in their own right, participating in this conflict. And we not only show how many new actors there are, but also all the different kinds of forums in which constitutional activity takes place. So not only in courthouses, but also on the streets, through protest, in legislatures, in administrative agencies, in international forums like the UN, in law reviews and scholarly publications. So what you see here is new actors and new forums. And I want to highlight 4 trends in what has come to be the new constitutional history. So I've put them up here, and I'm going to talk about each one briefly. I know this is all a little bit abstract, but we will soon move into my 2 examples, and I hope that they'll help you ground this in a useful way. So first, the first trend is less of a focus, this one's pretty obvious, on the Supreme Court. What's not obvious is really how hard that is to do. So Supreme Court cases are really easy to write about. It is very seductive to write about the Supreme Court. There are 9 people on the court. They start hearing cases on the first Monday in October. There's a clear conflict in each case, one side versus the other. The court's going to make a decision. There's a clear schedule, clear winners and losers. But if you focus on the Supreme Court, especially if you focus on one great case that the court decided, Brown versus Board of Education or Dobbs or any particular case, and by great I don't mean to say normatively great, I mean to say one very important case, whether you like its outcome or not. It makes it seem, if you really focus on the court, that the Supreme Court is all that's important and that the story is a really linear one in which the court is the key actor. So that's not really what's going on in this new constitutional history, and that's the first and most substantial trend. One thing to say about this, just to pull back a little, is that courts are really reactive institutions, right? Courts can't act unless people bring cases to them, which means that every case that a court hears is the result of a person determining that they have been harmed somehow and that they think the law should be able to redress their harm and fix their problem. Most cases, those folks then go to lawyers who help them articulate their problem in legal terms. That's not always the case. People can represent themselves, but they don't usually. And most of them have, somebody on the other side and lawyers on the other side who disagree and who are articulating why this is not a problem or why the problem should be resolved in another way. Now, I say this is what happens in every case, constitutional or not, Supreme Court or not, and sometimes cases seem mundane. I will tell you, as a lawyer, cases are almost never mundane for the people who are participating in them. Cases are almost always, and if you've ever been part of a legal case, they're almost always momentous in the lives of their participants. And what happens is those cases, however everyday they are, they can often be part of changing the meaning of the Constitution for all of us. And we're going to see that in the stories that I tell in a little bit. So it's impossible to understand the law without understanding what people want and how they bring these cases to courts. So one key part here in this moving the focus away from the Supreme Court is to shift the focus to everyday people. Everyday people are crucial to constitutional change. And you can already see here how I'm getting to empowerment, right? How thinking the court does it all is pretty disempowering, but everyday people being part of this process and a crucial part of this process, I find incredibly empowering. Another way to put this is to say the Supreme Court is really only one moment in constitutional change. It's often a latecomer to that change, contrary to what most people think. The Supreme Court not only has to wait until a case comes, but often waits to get involved. So there's a small part of the Supreme Court's docket of the cases that it hears that is mandated by law, cases they have to take, but a really very small part. Most of the cases they take, they have discretion about. They can choose whether to hear certain cases or not. And they will often get requests to hear cases and decide not to because they want to wait until more lower courts have weighed in. They want to wait and see what happens politically or legislatively or in social movements or with administrative actions. They call this percolation, especially what happens in lower courts. And this gives them a chance to hear what other actors think. So they are not the first word. And on the other end, they're never the last word either. Legislatures, social movements, officials, states are all reacting to cases and change. And they change what those mean and what they make possible, and they continue that legal process. So we can see this right now with all of the politics that are surrounding the Dobbs opinion about abortion. You can see that, yeah, the court did something, and what the court did was really important. And in addition, all these other actors are now interpreting it, reacting to it, creating change on their own, finding the spaces around what the court has done to continue to develop the law. So that's all. Less focus on the Supreme Court, really important point, very important takeaway. Second is this idea about conflict, the idea that constitutional history depicts contending views of constitutional meanings. None of these actors agree about what the law should be, and so constitutional history becomes about contestation and taking seriously. That means taking seriously the views that lost out at the Supreme Court, as well as the views that won. So not only winner's history, but loser's history. When you see the title of my first book in a minute, it's called The Lost Promise of Civil Rights. I am trying to recapture what were the views of people who didn't win, and not just didn't win, but didn't even really get a full hearing at the Supreme Court. So thinking about contingency, what was possible, what wasn't possible. What arguments did various groups try to put on the table as ways that we could interpret our Constitution that got lost because those alternatives did not win the day? And when we see what those alternatives are, I hope you'll see this as I give you the examples, we can actually see how then things might change in the future. Third is that the Supreme Court actually plays a lot of different roles in constitutional change. Usually we think the role the Supreme Court does is it says what the law is. And then the lawyers use that law to say new things about what the law is. And what the judges say will constrain them in the next case. Now, that's fairly controversial, and that's a topic of a lot of conversation these days. Are the justices constrained by prior precedents? Do they decide cases the way they want to? That may be a talk for another day. We can talk about it in Q&A if you want. But lots of the time we treat the Supreme Court as deciding cases based entirely on what the cases they decided before held. But that's not the only thing that the court does when it decides cases. When the court decides a case, it also creates narratives around that case. And it creates narratives that erase other narratives. So the Supreme Court cases take up a lot of space in our public imagination, and they generate some visions of American society and the constitutional order, and they kill other ones. So they tell us we're a segregated society or not, we prize reproductive freedom or not, we prize gun rights or not. And historians then, if you really only focus on the Supreme Court, you take for granted what the Supreme Court says is not only what they say, but it's true about the world. And so the historians then entrench those narratives. And it's a kind of a little addition problem, right? This is what the court decided must mean, this is what the Constitution means must mean, this is who we are and what we value. But to my mind, the many actors with their many views contending with each other, this multiplicity of stories, of nonlinearity, is what makes constitutional history so important. It's what makes it political. It's what makes it so contentious, and I think also so interesting and empowering. So when you make it less linear, when you decenter the court, and when you have more contestation, you enable the court to play different roles and to open up new opportunities in the future. So enables us to see how the court is shaping our imaginations about ourselves, about who is entitled to rights, and about how rights get vindicated. All right, fourth and finally is the importance of lawyers. I confess that, as Andy said, I am the dean of a law school. I am training lawyers. I think lawyers are forces for good in society. I'll come back to this a little bit later. And I think that lawyers really are, alongside the regular people that they represent, key actors in constitutional change. They're not always good actors. Lawyers both enable and amplify the claims of regular people, but they also discipline them. They also are gatekeepers, right? If you come to a lawyer and they won't take your case, they are shutting down your voice in some ways. So lawyers are really, really important in terms of mediating the way claims get articulated by regular people and the way they get heard by courts. And they really shape and translate a lot of what individuals and social movements are trying to accomplish. So to summarize, this new constitutional history in 1987 started with the idea that everyone has rights consciousness, and that's where the field has started ever since. But in addition, the field now thinks not only about that constitutional rights consciousness for its own sake, which was really the goal in 1987, was to say, these folks really have constitutional ideas, not just the Supreme Court. What we do today is say that is the case. And also, we want to think about what the relationship between that rights consciousness is with the Supreme Court, with other legal actors. What are all the many actors involved in this process, and how does this process work? So I hope that you can see why who interprets the Constitution is deeply related to how historians write about constitutional change. If all kinds of people interpret the Constitution, then the way historians write about that process looks very different. It's not so focused on the Supreme Court. It embraces a new way of telling constitutional history that has a tremendous impact not only on how we see our past, but what we know about the Constitution today and how we think about it in the future. Okay, so that's all a little abstract. Let me stop here for questions or comments, but when we come back to my lecture, I will provide you with 2 examples. So Andy, any questions for now?
We do. We have a few questions that have queued up. Thank you, Professor. And again, I'll remind the audience that if you'd like to submit a formal question or a clarification about anything that we are discussing, please do use the Ask the Professor tab. And I'll pay attention to that, I'll monitor that, and bring them forward at the right time. 2 questions at this point, Professor. The first one comes from Monica, who's in Kansas City. And in some ways, Monica, and I'm going to paraphrase this for you, so add in the chat box if I miss some of the nuance. I think this is a question you talked about, but I think maybe putting a finer point on it would be helpful for our educators with younger students. When you share this moment when the OEH Journal 1987 comes out, and it's kind of this shift into this new history and this new way of looking at it, is the suggestion that all the actors that you listed were always a part of the story, just not visible, or that the actors themselves were new to the scene?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I think they were always part of the story, and their stories had not been told. So, some of the articles in that volume are about the Revolutionary War period. Some of them are about slavery. So, absolutely about, this is not saying that constitutional rights consciousness began in 1987. It's that it was always there, but it was not always depicted.
Yeah, such a powerful point, particularly in terms of that empowerment to see the many actors and to understand that the law and the things that govern us are ideas, and ideas that are breathed into life with imagination and with agency. Thank you for clarifying that. Next question comes from Robert. Robert is just outside of Philadelphia, and again referencing the 1987 journal. It seems like one of the smart things to do in these kinds of conversations is to imagine what the opponents might say. What was the pushback on that journal? What was the criticism of that new constitutional history perspective?
It's such a good question. I think the pushback was really, and this is maybe part of where the field has evolved since then, I don't think it was necessarily pushback against the volume directly, but I think the indirect pushback was really, that's all very nice and good that people have those views or have constitutional consciousness, but yet and still the action is really all at the Supreme Court, right? So I think there was this idea that, great, you've excavated that regular people have constitutional consciousness, but it doesn't necessarily translate into what the law means, what the formal understanding of the law means. And I think part of what has happened in the years since then is an effort in my work and others, as we'll see in a minute, to show, number one, I think Hartog and others would say, well, no, the constitutional consciousness is important in and of itself, regardless of whether it connects to the formal law. And thinking of the formal law as the only law is problematic. Law is pluralist. And there are many laws, and oftentimes what these folks think is what they live and is what the law is on the ground, regardless of what the Supreme Court said. But in addition, I think that where the field has gone has been to put into conversation that constitutional consciousness, as historians would say, from below, of regular people, with these ideas of the formal legal process from on high. And I hadn't really, it's a great question, I hadn't really thought about it in these terms, but our effort to do that is kind of a rejoinder to that criticism that, well, does it really matter? And I think there are folks, as I say, and I'm among them, who would say it does matter in and of itself, and law is always plural. And I would add, it matters also because you can't actually understand what the Supreme Court is doing unless you understand what regular people think as well.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And, it's a reminder, too, that education is always sort of a self-contained, self-fulfilling prophecy. I suspect that, as a parent of kids that could be in your law classes, as, many of our folks in our audience who have kids that they taught, 10 years ago who now could be in your law classes, it seems like we're also at a generational point where young people could really get into what you're describing. And then, of course, once you've trained these lawyers, now they're more self-aware actors in the ways that you've described.
Absolutely, and I tell our law students all the time about the important role that they play and the important role that their clients will play in bringing them the cases that they then, get to shape, and how much power they have, and the obligation that they have to use that power with integrity and responsibly because of how powerful it is in the world.
Fantastic. Well, part of my job is to be the timekeeper, so I'm going to encourage us to maybe move to part 2, your next vignette, and we'll again collect questions for the next break.
Great. Okay, so part 2 is my first example, and that is about the making of modern civil rights. So this example retells the story of a case that you know through my new approach, and then my second example will tell you a story that I'm pretty sure you don't know. Okay, so you all know the story of Brown versus Board of Education, and usually that story is told as this band of courageous lawyers in the NAACP who decided to challenge segregation, brought these cases to the Supreme Court, and the court found school segregation unconstitutional. That story is a true story as far as it goes. Brown is a crucially important case because the Supreme Court said that segregation was unconstitutional. Sorry, not ready for that yet. And it began a new desegregation era, and a Supreme Court decision coming out the other way, in my view, would have been, absolutely terrible. Using the tools of the new constitutional history we've just been talking about, though, shows us many more reasons why Brown is important beyond that one. And we usually tell the story of Brown from the ending backward. We know what happened in 1954, and then we trace how we got there. But the new constitutional history doesn't start with winner's history. It asks, what would it look like if we start our story before with different actors from the point of view of not knowing that Brown was coming? And for example, what would it look like if we ask, what did working class African Americans think the problems with Jim Crow were? What was it that they wanted to change? What did they want lawyers or the Constitution to speak to? And there's a good reason, in my view, to start with the claims of Black workers during Jim Crow. They were really central for two reasons. First, Jim Crow was really a system, a multiplicitous system. It was about both racial hierarchy and economic exploitation. So let me say what I mean by that. If you think about slavery, slavery was a system that also performed many functions. Two of the signal functions that it performed were racial and labor functions. So the question that white Southerners asked themselves after slavery was, how would they prevent newly freed Black Americans from contaminating the white race, from debasing white politics, right? They wanted to keep them separate. They wanted to keep them unequal as a racial matter. And the second question they asked themselves was, how would they find a replacement for the cheap labor that Black enslaved people had previously provided and on which the Southern economy was largely based? And Jim Crow was an answer to both questions. It was a system that racially subordinated Black Americans and that maintained economic exploitation. So it was a formal legal system and also a material unequal system. And it was a public system and a private system. So we often, when we think about Jim Crow, and this is partly, as we'll see, I think a vision of Jim Crow that comes out of Brown, we think about formal inequality, laws that required school segregation, laws that prohibited Black Americans from voting, signs that segregated water fountains. Jim Crow was about those things, and it was also about access to worse jobs, less money, what today we think of as the wealth gap, worse schools, as you all know, a lack of personal safety and security, lynchings, slavery, involuntary servitude, police brutality. So this is about the material reality and about violence and poverty and inequality, as well as about formal law. So when Black workers started making claims to lawyers before Brown versus Board of Education, their claims emerged from both the formal legal problems that they saw and also from these material inequalities that they experienced. The second reason that Black workers' claims were central before Brown were because of the legal, political, and intellectual climate at the time. So during the 1940s, during the Depression, there was a revolution in law, these new labor rights. There was a revolution at the Supreme Court where people now had the right to join unions, collectively bargain. There were maximum hours and minimum wage laws, the social safety net as we know it. A lot of that was created in the 1930s. But that often excluded Black workers. The Democratic Party under Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a mix of Northern liberals and Southern segregationists, and they excluded domestic workers and agricultural workers, which was where a lot of Black Southerners worked at the time, from these benefits. Now, during the 1940s, Black Americans gained both economic and political power. They were fighting in the war. They were contributing to the war effort on the home front. Many African Americans, there was a second Great Migration around this time, so they moved north. They were now able to vote, unlike in the South, where they were largely disenfranchised. They were working in war industries. They were joining organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League. Those organizations had increasingly loud voices. The rhetoric of the war helped with that because it was rhetoric about freedom and democracy. There was the Double V campaign, which was the idea about victory against fascism, both home and abroad. At home, fascism being Jim Crow and segregation. So the complaints of Black workers was the place I went to look to say, how should we understand what Jim Crow looked like before we got it filtered through the Supreme Court and Brown? And their complaints were a crucial part of the creation of new constitutional law and of constitutional meaning. So what were their complaints? For agricultural workers, the complaints were really about peonage and involuntary servitude. They were being often held against their will through violence, through imprisonment. Their landlords stole their money and their crops, and the laws of the South enabled landlords to do that. They often worked under terrible conditions for little or no wages. For industrial workers, they were excluded from many industries. They were forced to work in what were called the 3 H's, hot, heavy, and hard jobs. They worked in segregated jobs and under segregated conditions for low and unequal pay. They were subject often to violence on the job, and unemployment was far greater. It was harder to get a job. So when these lawyers were when these workers were complaining to lawyers, they found lawyers who amplified their voices. And there were two main groups of them. The one was the Civil Rights Section, which was a new part of the Department of Justice created in 1939, and one was the NAACP. And both of these groups of lawyers were thinking a lot about how they would promote civil rights in the decade and a half before Brown versus Board of Education. So in the Civil Rights Section, these are government lawyers in the FDR administration. They are white and mostly men. Politically, it's hard for them to go after segregation, hard for them to go after Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court case that had said that it was constitutional to have segregation. These were politically hard for them to do, was to go after those. But they did see other opportunities. And in particular, they used the 13th Amendment. So these agricultural workers and also domestic workers brought very desperate complaints to them about really being held in involuntary servitude. And that was clearly unconstitutional under the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which was ratified right after the Civil War in 1865 and outlawed slavery and involuntary servitude. And what these lawyers did in response to these complaints was expand how they thought about and how courts thought about what the 13th Amendment protected. So their idea was it doesn't only protect against outright slavery or involuntary servitude, it also protects against not making enough money. It also protects against not having labor rights. And so the Civil Rights Section used the 13th Amendment to try to get the kinds of rights that Black workers had been excluded from during the New Deal under the 13th Amendment. And they asked this question, not just what could they stop government from doing that might be bad for Black workers, but how could they find affirmative government protection to protect Black workers from not only the government, but from private actors who were lynching them, who were engaging in police brutality, who were virtually enslaving them. And they really, in particular, were focused on providing additional economic rights and economic protection that these workers found it really hard to find. And they had real success in the courts, and some cases in which even the Supreme Court seemed to understand the 13th Amendment as ensuring a kind of labor freedom and a kind of economic security for the poorest and most politically marginalized Black workers. The NAACP lawyers were quite different from the Civil Rights Section lawyers. They were mostly African American. They worked for this private nonprofit organization. They had to answer not to political parties, but to their funders and to their membership, which were mostly middle-class Blacks. And during World War II, increasingly included working-class Black war workers who moved to northern cities. And these industrial workers were coming to the NAACP and saying, we have complaints. And the NAACP said, yeah, those are good complaints. We should take on your cases. And in those cases, they argued both that these workers should be protected under the 14th Amendment against discrimination and segregation. And also, they argued generally for a right to a job, for a right to work, for a right to advance economically. They were always opposed, the NAACP, to segregation, but they also understood that economic advancement within the confines of segregation was really important to many workers, and that's what workers were asking for often, and they worked toward that goal as well. And in addition, and this is really important, they saw that the complaints that they were receiving were not only complaints about the government and about laws, they were also complaints about private actors, about private employers, and about unions. And so this was not only about formal legal segregation or discrimination, it was also about ending inequality and ending exploitation against private employers. Now, in 1950, 1951, the NAACP's priorities shifted, and they started thinking less about workers and more about education. There are a number of really good reasons for that. The Cold War, they're changing relationships with unions where they were getting much closer with unions. But as a result, and I can say more about those reasons in Q&A if you like, as a result, they started to think really only about the Equal Protection Clause and thinking about the government's segregation and discrimination against African Americans, not also about private actors, not also about a right to work, not also about increasing wages or access to particular jobs. And in particular, their goal came to be overruling Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was the case that said in 1896, well, yeah, segregation, it separates the races, but it doesn't really mean anyone is inferior to anyone else. That's not what these laws say. And if Black Americans think that, they're just thinking that themselves. That's not because that's what anybody intended, which was crazy. And of course it was what was intended. And so the NAACP said, we need to find a way to prove that classifying people on the basis of race, that segregating people on the basis of race is in and itself a harm, that the Constitution should recognize and that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment should prohibit. So the NAACP's vision kind of wins out against the Civil Rights Section's vision, and they bring this series of cases to the Supreme Court in 1954, and the court decides in their favor in Brown. And in doing so, it's a huge victory, a really important victory. I can't emphasize enough how important it was that the court finds in favor of the NAACP. At the same time, the way the cases come to be, we're now talking about education, which is crucially important, and I know you all think that too, but we've lost the importance of work. We've lost the importance of economic inequality, and we've lost the importance of poverty and violence and exploitation and powerlessness. The harm that Brown comes to stand for is a dignitary, stigmatic, symbolic, psychological harm. That's what the NAACP focuses on. That is a crucially important harm. It's a harm we're still talking about today. And yet, that harm would have looked pretty odd to an enslaved agricultural worker in the pre-Brown era. It was simply not responsive to the violence, exploitation, and powerlessness that they experienced in their everyday life. So Brown ushers in this new era of desegregation, and that's a positive thing. And at the same time, it closes off this era where there was a lot of experimentation about what civil rights might look like, and in particular about labor and economic rights that African American workers had asked for redress from. And then Brown set us on this path that has really dominated our imaginations. And I want to pause here for a second just to say, when we talk about a case, what is a case? We mean lots of different things. We mean the process. We mean the outcome. Who won? Brown won. We mean the doctrine, separate isn't equal under the Equal Protection Clause. We mean the legal rhetoric and its implications. Separate is never equal. We mean that the instructions that the case gives to lower courts, Brown says, Brown 2 especially says, right, with all deliberate speed, right? Those are the instructions that the lower courts get that really affect how Brown gets interpreted later. And we also mean a political intervention, right? The court sided with the NAACP instead of the White South. We mean a cultural symbol. The court vindicated the rights of these Black school children. That's a very powerful cultural symbol. And we also mean that there's this constructed image of social reality, right? So this case describes Jim Crow as a system of state-mandated segregation, not of private economic exploitation. And that image really sticks. So what a case says is important not just for its precedent, it's also important because it empowers some people, disempowers others. It angers some people, creates backlash, and it creates categories and ideas that reflect back into the world. And so after Brown, we then looked back and rewrote the history of before Brown in ways that erased what went before Brown. This is why I call it a lost history. You've never heard of this alternative history because Brown treated Jim Crow as if the entirety of Jim Crow was what Brown described it as. And we lost the other half, the private half, the economic inequality, the 13th Amendment half. and created this idea of of Jim Crow as really being about the formal law. And as a result, I think we have since told stories that Brown created equality, and if there's still inequality in the world, that's because people are unequal, and the law has to be neutral between the races because the playing field has been level, and if the law is just neutral, we will all be equal in the world. You can see this, I think, in the affirmative action debates. If we're all on an equal playing field, then affirmative action unfairly unlevels the playing field. But if Brown never really ended all of Jim Crow, if it only ended half of Jim Crow, if we're not on a level playing field, that there are continuing inequalities, that affirmative action might be necessary to redress them. So Brown, I think, has really led us to think about the law in ways that are quite narrow. And I don't mean to criticize Brown in telling you this story. Brown was crucially important. And I don't think necessarily we would be in a better world if the NAACP had said, well, attack material inequality only and not formal inequality. Jim Crow was both, and we needed to uproot both. The NAACP did an amazing job in using the limited resources they had to make the choices that they did, but the choices also had consequences. And so how we think about civil rights today is really a product of the way that Brown shaped our understanding of what Jim Crow was before. And I think it leads us to believe that the currently racially inflected economic inequalities that we still see are happenstance, that they're not part of this long legal history. And yet once we see Jim Crow in its entirety, we can see that, that we only addressed half of Jim Crow, and there's another half that needs to be addressed. And I think it really opens up what we could think future understandings of constitutional law might be. So I hope that seeing this story through the lens of the new constitutional history can enable you to see that there are other possible interpretations and to see what role the law has played in our current situation, and therefore open up new ways of thinking about the law going forward again. And I will open it back up for questions or comments.
Fantastic. We do have some questions that have come in, Professor. And the first one comes from Michelle. Michelle is joining us tonight from Spring Independent School District just outside of Houston, Texas. And Michelle actually made this comment in the audience chat and then at my invitation reframed it as a question for you. She writes, with the 13th Amendment's clause of involuntary servitude, freed slaves had their rights restricted drastically. This began the prison system that we have today because of the money that is required from a prisoner's labor. Do you, Professor, believe that the prison system will change with the Enlightenment of what it was built on?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the 13th Amendment for a second. I think that what you're talking about here is the between the commas part of this amendment, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And I do think that the 13th Amendment, there are alternative stories to tell about the 13th Amendment, and you're telling one, and it's one I tell actually in Lost Promise as well, which is it does end slavery, but it has this enormous loophole. And white Southerners use that loophole immediately to start arresting African Americans and putting them to work in prisons and on plantations plantation prison systems, and that those are really important routes to our current incarceration crisis. So I do think that people have told this story, the new Jim Crow and others, the relationship between this history and our current situation. And I do think that understanding the relationship between slavery and incarceration today is crucially important and can, as the story I just told, also open up real opportunities to rethink criminal justice today.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question comes from Don. Don is in Hickory, North Carolina. And I think Don means this question, particularly the earlier chronology of this most recent story that you told. Talk to us a little bit about the communication that is required for individual actors and agents of change, as you've described them, to realize that they're not by themselves. How did these ideas spread? How did, in a more contemporary time, we can imagine all the different ways that people organize and get together, but how did the word get out?
Absolutely. So I will say that when I first started the project that became the Lost Promise of Civil Rights, which was my dissertation, my history dissertation, I had heard that there were letters from Black agricultural workers in the Department of Justice archives, and I went looking for them, and there were tons of them. And in particular, I found these letters from young African-American men who were recruited to go work for the United States Sugar Corporation during the World War II in Florida. And they were lured there by promises of, free transportation and good wages. A lot of them thought they were working for the government because it was the United States Sugar Corporation. And they started, the first way that their letters, and actually the first article that I wrote about this, and I thought about giving to you, but I didn't, is about these forms of communication. So once they went and they were virtually enslaved and they couldn't leave, their mothers started writing to President Roosevelt. And their mothers who wrote were mostly domestic workers, and they were writing to President Roosevelt in a kind of paternalistic frame. They were saying, I'm a poor Negro widow, and I am asking for your help. And they were very much asking for largesse, asking for kindness from the president. And they didn't know who to write, right? That's why they wrote to the president. By the time this story continues, many of these men escape. They find their way home. They join the army, some of them, and they start to learn their way through the government systems. They find the FBI offices in their towns. They go to the FBI offices in their uniforms. They say, I am a citizen and a soldier, and I have a right not to be enslaved, and you need to protect my right. And at the beginning, these folks came from particular communities. And so the mothers are all talking as they are sending their letters. And in addition, they go to their employers, and some of their employers who are white and middle class or upper middle class start sending letters too, start calling FBI offices. They provide a link to these more formal systems. And then, as these young men start to see themselves not as beneficiaries of paternalism, but as rights bearers, they start to understand how these systems work, and then the FBI launches a full-scale investigation. So we're really talking about, networks within communities is one of the main ways. And then the other thing I will say, and I'll stop as a long answer, is the lawyers themselves. So once the Department of Justice becomes aware, they start to send out FBI agents, they start to do investigations. Once the NAACP is aware of particular kinds of problems, they will go to a plant, they will talk to people, they will go to where people live, where they socialize, and start to gather information. So you have individuals who create their own networks, and then you have all kinds of people who act as kind of mediators and liaisons. But it's a crucially important question, and it was so much harder to do, before we had social media and email and all kinds of other technologies.
Yeah, the answer I just heard you give was moms.
Well, moms is a big
what a mom can do.
That's right.
That's right.
But I will say, and one of the things that happens when you look at the history of Jim Crow is people are subject to violence for speaking out, right? It's really scary and dangerous, and people are killed for it. And so being able to speak and finding lawyers who are willing to take your cases is something, not to take lightly at all.
Absolutely. Professor, unfortunately, we have about 23 minutes left, so I'm going to encourage us to move through. Let's do your next two sections, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Great. That sounds perfect. Okay, so our first example was what you could see new about a history of a case that you already know. And the second example, drawn from my second book, describes a different kind of legal and constitutional history campaign that I'm guessing you've never heard of. And the participants here are both everyday lawyers, everyday people and lawyers who acted often independent from one another, at least initially, but whose actions in their own, regular everyday cases collectively over time had a tremendous impact. So in the first story, the lawyers are thinking about how to make legal change from the beginning. In this story, the lawyers are really responding to individual problems from the beginning, and it's only over time that they start to see the nature of legal change. So I'm going to tell you a few of these stories. So the first one is a man named Isador Edelman, who was a soapbox orator in 1949 California. And he would talk for hours and hours on a park bench in Pershing Square. I know we've got a lot of folks from LA here. He would literally take the bus, all the way across LA. This is how it was his calling. And he talked about politics and economics. He was a communist. Though he'd been kicked out of the Communist Party for being a troublemaker, he was often kicked out of organizations. But he was a lefty. 1949, the early Cold War, not a good time to be spouting lefty views in public. And he was regularly arrested for littering, for soliciting funds, for all kinds of things. And eventually he gets arrested for vagrancy. So vagrancy law in California made a vagrant at the time, made a vagrant of anyone who was quote unquote dissolute. Dissolute meant lawless. Edelman had been arrested before, so therefore he must be lawless, and then he must be dissolute, and he must be a vagrant. So you might ask, well, why use vagrancy law? That's so weird. And that's because that's what the police did. Vagrancy laws had come to the American colonies from England, which for 400 years by this time had criminalized vagrancy. It made it a crime to be poor and idle. Vagrancy laws made it a crime to wander about with no apparent purpose. There was a law, a 1972 law in Jacksonville, Florida, and you can see it here. I've eliminated a few parts, but this is a lot of the law, and you can see it lists lots of different kinds of people, right? Common drunkards, common night walkers, dissolute persons who go about begging, persons wandering or strolling around from place to place, habitual loafers, disorderly persons. This is the kind of law, and you'll see that it says, shall be deemed vagrants. And these laws were appealing. They were used in all 50 states, and they were appealing for two reasons. One is because most laws criminalize conduct. If you do this thing, then you have violated this law. Vagrancy laws make it a crime to be a kind of person. Once you're deemed a vagrant, you're a vagrant until you can prove that you're not. And you can be arrested on site for being a vagrant. In addition, as you can see from this law, these laws were almost infinitely flexible, and the police used them for all kinds of purposes. Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested under vagrancy laws every year. They were used to force poor people to go to work, to keep out suspicious strangers from communities, to suppress people who seemed different in ways that might be dangerous, to stop potential crimes before they were committed, and to keep racial minorities, political troublemakers, and non-conforming rebels at bay. They were long used against political dissidents like Isador Edelman, against Wobblies, labor organizers, and communists. This is an example of a cartoon showing that Jesus Christ would have been arrested as a vagrant. This is how people were, this is obviously a critique of vagrancy law. Even Jesus Christ would have been arrested as a vagrant. And so vagrancy laws were used often against free speakers. And so when they used these laws against Isador Edelman, the police were doing what they always did. And in 1949, even though vagrancy laws were different from all other laws, everybody recognized that, they were totally constitutional. Judges, law professors, lawyers, treatises, everybody said, oh, these laws are different, but they've been around for hundreds of years. They're in all 50 states. People use them all the time. These are just fine. And Isador Edelman wanted to change that. He didn't think he should be a vagrant because of his unpopular speech. So he took his case to trial. He had a 9-day trial for this very small count. And then his lawyer, he lost. His lawyers took it to the Supreme Court. At the end of the day, the court did not decide his case. They weren't quite ready. This is one of those times when they weren't ready to make a decision. And so they let his law stand. They took his case initially, and then they dismissed it, and they let the law stand. So to me, Edelman really represents the power of the regular person to change the world. He stood up for his rights, and though he lost, he set in motion other cases that set in motion other cases that eventually lead to change, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, you might say, well, is he really a regular person? If he's a member of the Communist Party, he's really politically active and empowered. So let me bring you to our second story, which shows that it was not only people like Isador Edelman who pushed the Supreme Court to act. So this is the story of Sam Thompson, who was remembered as Shuffling Sam Thompson. Sam Thompson was African-American. He was an alcoholic. He was quite poor. He peddled junk for a living, and he spent one day a week working as a handyman. And he was often arrested in 1950s Louisville, Kentucky. That's just his life and how things went. The police had the power to arrest anyone, and often those anyones were people like Thompson, who had very little power themselves, and they arrested them for any reason or no reason at all. One time, Thompson got arrested, and he thought it was unjust. The circumstances he thought were unjust. And so he decided he was going to fight this arrest instead of just going to the low-level court and, getting his short jail stay and then getting out and going back to what he was doing, what people called at the time the revolving door of the criminal justice system. And it turned out that the person that he worked for one day a week as a handyman was a man named Dr. Wynant Dean, who was on the board of the Kentucky Civil Liberties Union that had just been created, an affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. And he connected Thompson to a KCLU lawyer named Louis Lusky. Louis Lusky was a very fancy lawyer. He graduated first in his class from Columbia Law School. He'd been a Supreme Court clerk. And so Lusky accompanies Thompson into this very low-level police court, and he's got papers and briefs and high-level constitutional arguments, and no one there is happy. The prosecutor's mad, the police are mad, the judge is mad. And they say, literally, Judge, he's making a federal case out of this. Like, literally, the cliche was in the transcript of the case. And in fact, after they go to court, the police target Sam Thompson even more. They arrest him all the time. He, in fact, stops going to the bus station where he's often arrested because he fears being arrested. And he goes to a cafe that's at the end of Liberty and West Streets. I can't help but say this, called the Liberty End Cafe, where he gets arrested again. You can't really make up that name. And they go back to the court and they make their arguments again. And he loses. And Lusky takes Thompson's court all the way to the Supreme Court. And the justices marvel at the whole thing. They can't get over how often Sam Thompson is arrested. They can't get over how few protections he has procedurally in this low-level court. They can't get over how vague the laws are. They can't get over how little evidence there was to have arrested Sam Thompson in this bar where he was waiting for his bus and shuffling his feet to the jukebox, hence the nickname Shuffling Sam Thompson. So they get this glimpse into Thompson's world, and they do decide his case, but they decide it in a fairly narrow way in 1960. So Thompson obviously is not like Edelman. He has very little education. He has no political support, but he saw this injustice and he found resources in his own life that he could use, again, going to that question that was asked, and he put the change in motion. There are so many more stories that I could tell you, including of civil rights leader Fred Shuttlesworth, who was arrested in Birmingham under one of these laws, of hippies, of transgender Americans, all kinds of people. Virtually every social movement of the 1960s challenged these laws. African Americans and other civil rights activists, communists, labor union members, poor people, beats, hippies, gay men, lesbian, transgender Americans and other sexual minorities, women, Vietnam War protesters, student activists, young urban men of color, and other dissidents. And this was no coincidence. These laws had been used to regulate anybody who seemed out of place in any way. And now, in the 1960s, these folks are organized, they're in social movements, they are asserting their rights, and they found that these vagrancy laws were obstacles to their other goals because they would walk outside and get arrested. They would sometimes even get arrested in their own homes for vagrancy, and so they couldn't possibly achieve racial equality or sexual freedom or political protest so long as these vagrancy laws were still on the books. And importantly, they had lawyers. The NAACP and others defended them, the ACLU and their affiliates, legal aid lawyers, public defenders, private lawyers who took these cases pro bono, and were working really hard to figure out how to make these really low-level criminal claims that nobody had ever thought about as constitutional rights before into constitutional claims. And so the lawyers began with each person in a different social setting with these discrete problems, and they started to see connections between them. And what's really crucial about this is these aren't famous lawyers. This isn't Thurgood Marshall or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it's not just national organizations like the NAACP or the ACLU. These are all kinds of lawyers who were wielding this power and who are amplifying the voices of regular people to make change in these laws. So over the course of the 1960s, these cases are funneling through the courts, as well as people are making changes in their laws in the states. Police departments stop using the laws because they see that they're going to be unconstitutional. So even while the court is struggling with this issue, and it takes like about a dozen cases and tries to figure out what to do with them without ever succeeding for 20 years, change is happening without the Supreme Court. So that brings me to my third and final story, which is about Margaret Lorraine Papachristou, who was arrested in 1969 Jacksonville under the law that you saw earlier. She was out on the town with another friend, another white woman like her, and with two black men. This is 1969 Jacksonville. This was quite a violation of sexual and cultural norms, and they were arrested by the police for vagrancy by prowling by auto. Now, if you looked and read that the law that I showed you, it wasn't there, and it wasn't in anything I omitted, but no one cared that it wasn't in the law because the vagrancy law was flexible, and they were all convicted. So by this point, the enormous scope of this problem, of the vagrancy law problem, had become much more apparent, and lawyers had begun to look for the kind of case that they could take to the court that would force the court to act. And this one lawyer, Sam Jacobson, sees himself as part of a campaign, a cause, a vagrancy law cause, and he puts together a package to take to the court to show the court a whole bunch of different problems with vagrancy laws. These two interracial couples, poor people, nonconformists, suspected criminals. And it's only after people like Edelman and Thompson and Lusky and others all across the country brought their individual cases that lawyers like Sam Jacobson could find a way to bring a case that brought it all together and that finally got the court to act. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that the court and the justices don't play a role. They play a really important role. They decided that case, Papachristou v. City of Jacksonville, unanimously in 1972. Justice William O. Douglas was the key justice here. He was a Supreme Court justice, had been on the court for 30 years by that point, but still sort of thought of himself a little bit as a hobo, and was always pushing these vagrancy cases. And so he writes this opinion that is kind of a paean to independence and what he calls quintessential American feelings of independence and self-confidence, the feeling of creativity. He says Americans have the right of dissent, the right to be nonconformists, and the right to defy submissiveness, and that laws like vagrancy laws should not stand in the way of lives of high spirits rather than hushed, suffocating silence. This opinion is about vagrancy laws, and to him, it's about the essential American spirit. And the opinion was so close to his heart that he wanted it read at his funeral. So over the course of 20 years, vagrancy laws go from totally constitutional, with Edelman banging his head against the wall trying to make someone see that these laws are problematic, to clearly unconstitutional in the views of the Supreme Court. Now, if all you did was see Papachristou v. City of Jacksonville, you would answer the question, how did that happen, by saying the Supreme Court did it. But actually, once I tell you this whole story, that may be the most visible part, but it's not the whole story. It was regular people exercising power who brought down this 400-year-old legal regime that had been used in virtually every state and every city in the nation. They experienced a harm. They decided it was an injustice. They determined to make change happen. And then they brought these concerns to lawyers, who then brought these concerns to courts and eventually the Supreme Court, which was late to the party and not the only guest. And in fact, the Supreme Court was not only not the first step in changing the Constitution, it also wasn't the last. So even after Papa Christou, the police find new ways to reach their goals of crime control and social control. You can think about stop and frisk doing this, giving the police lots of discretion. You can imagine new panhandling laws, new laws about sleeping in public that regulate homeless people, the unhoused. And again, these folks brought their complaints, and again, the lawyers brought them to courts. And so the Supreme Court decision is one moment in this process. That moment is really important. It reshapes the conversation about what power looks like, about who has power, what power the police should have. But even after the court acts, it takes all kinds of other actors to assess, interpret, and implement what the court said and how the court imagined it. And this means that there was not just changes on the ground that happened as a result of this vagrancy law movement, but also changes in how we think about the Constitution. So usually we think the Constitution speaks to big issues, right? The idea that a vagrancy conviction with a $20 fine was a constitutional issue seemed crazy. The idea that someone like Sam Thompson would think of himself as a person with rights and that other people would think of him as a person with constitutional rights seemed unlikely. So this story shows us that any kind of harm, every kind of harm, even what might seem the smallest kinds of harms experienced by people who have very little power in the world, can become constitutional issues and be vindicated even through the formal legal process. Second, the vagrancy law challenge put the Constitution squarely on the side of the challengers, of the outsiders, of the formally powerless, whereas before it had really been on the side of the police. And this really gave outsiders a huge new weapon and took one away from, quote unquote, the establishment. And it was part of the larger increase in tolerance and pluralism that was crucial to the 1960s. And even though there wasn't complete change on every level, this success of the vagrancy law challenge really fundamentally changed the constitutional conversation and thereby changed the political, social, and institutional conversations. So let's go to why all of this matters, and then
this is going to be your challenge, Professor. We've got about 5 minutes. I have at least one question I want to bring to you. So
great. I have two pages left of notes, so I am almost done. So this will be 2 more minutes. So let me just say why it matters. So lesson 1, it is possible to overturn 400 years of court precedent. It is possible to overturn legal segregation. Constitutional change can be made, and it starts with regular people. Lesson 2, the Supreme Court is not and never should be the only target. There are all kinds of places where you can make constitutional change happen. Number 3, there's no silver bullet. Constitutional change is slow and it's never complete. It's a process, an activity, not a moment or an outcome. And now, most importantly, and Andy, this is where I want you to get before we open it up for questions.
Hooray.
You all, as teachers, are crucial. And I say this on my slide, you are a lot like lawyers. You might not think that's a compliment. You might not like lawyers. I think it's a huge compliment. You all amplify the voices of your students. You give them tools and language. You empower them. You teach them how the world works, and you foster their imaginations about how it can be different. So when you teach about the Constitution and when you teach about the Supreme Court, you are fostering in them the quintessential American feelings that Justice Douglas talked about. So when you look around and you see that something is wrong, when your students see that something is wrong, I want to encourage you to think of yourselves as a crucial part of our constitutional conversation, and that you don't think that the Constitution is something out there that belongs to other people, the Supreme Court, or fancy lawyers in distant organizations, but that you think about its very first words, we the people, and know that this is a document whose meaning belongs to both you and your students. All right, we got 3 minutes, Andy.
Well played and well done. Thank you so much for particularly tying it up as you did. It does matter, and I suspect, and I've seen some of the comments in the chat box, that teachers acknowledge and recognize that one of the reasons they're in the profession they're in is to do exactly what you're describing. I'm going to give the last question for tonight to Shweta. Shweta is from Southern California, Los Angeles Unified. I think this is a wonderful question that I'd like to bring to you. September 17th is Constitution Day. You, Professor, have provided us with a new lens with which we can look at amendments and laws, but is there a specific case or amendment you suggest schools focus on for a school-wide event?
Fascinating. A school-wide event. I mean, partly, I guess it depends what age you're talking about. But I actually think I would focus on the preamble. So I think we too often focus on a particular clause that leads to particular cases, and we don't think about the preamble. But the preamble, we the people, and what the purpose of the Constitution is for, enables you to really pull back and ask, what is this document? Why do we have it? What does it do for us? And in one way, the document is a roadmap for democracy, right? The State of the Union address is in the document. It tells the president he's got to report to Congress once a year, and it's very mundane, right? You have age requirements for various people, and but in another way, right? This document is our aspirations. This is our civil religion. This is a document that grounds us in a single conversation about what our values are, how our democracy should function, and what role we play in it, right? Who are we the people? How has we the people changed over time, which it has dramatically, right? Lots of people who are in this conversation, including me, were not thought to be part of we the people at the founding. So to ask those big questions by looking at the preamble is one thing I would do for a school-wide event.
It's a fantastic place to conclude. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Professor. We appreciate your passion and your nuance, and I look forward to seeing the ways in which our teachers will implement this in their classrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
I want to thank everybody in our audience for joining us tonight. I also want to thank Sherilyn Stauffer for being here as our TA, and Sherilyn will be developing an instructional approach to take something that she's learned tonight into the classroom and in practice, and we'll be sure to circulate that. Do pay attention to the National Humanities Center social media feeds, our Twitter and our Facebook page, in order to see upcoming opportunities and ways in which we'll be working with you and supporting you. That does include our next webinar, scheduled for 6 days, next Tuesday. Julian Zelizer from Princeton will be joining us to discuss the presidency of Jimmy Carter. And I hope you're able to join us. I hope you also will consider sharing the registration link with your colleagues and with your departments. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for spending some time with us. We hope to see you at a future webinar. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you next time in the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.